So in this video, we'll look at one of the more common types of argument-based passage questions, and that is the type of question that asks you how to strengthen an argument or conclusion. And here's an example that we'll get into in more detail, but just to see what it looks like. Which of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument? So we'll return to this in a minute. To start with, the correct answer to a strengthening an argument question will usually be one that introduces additional supporting evidence. What do we call supporting evidence? We call that a premise. So something that introduces another premise in support of the argument. And typically, this will confirm an unstated assumption or fill a gap in the argument, a gap or a hole in the argument. So in other words, if there's an assumption that the argument makes that causes some uncertainty as to whether the conclusion is actually valid, well, if we can supply some piece of information that shows that that assumption is warranted or valid, then what that does is it gets rid of something that would have potentially weakened the argument, and in doing so, it will strengthen the argument. Now, an incorrect answer to one of these questions will do one of two things. It will either weaken the argument or it will just be irrelevant. That is, it won't strengthen the argument, but it also won't weaken it. You'll see a mix of those on these questions as far as the wrong answers go. And we want to make sure to be mindful of the conclusion, that is, the specific point being made in the conclusion, because if you're asked to strengthen an argument, you need to be clear on what that argument is. And you also want to be wary of answer choices that hint at the conclusion without actually supporting it. Both parts of this are important. You want to understand the argument, and you want to make sure that the option you're selecting is actually strengthening that argument. So the steps that we want to take in dealing with these passages and questions. We're going to read the passage and identify the conclusion, the point that the argument is trying to make, and then working backward from the conclusion, identify the premise and the counter premise. Again, both of those can be plural. One or both of those can be plural. Then try to identify at least one assumption that the argument takes for granted. If you can identify multiple assumptions, focus in on the one that seems like it's the most important. And that will act, at least to begin with, as your approximate answer, something that you can use as you go to look through the answer choices. Now, before turning your attention to the answer choices, make sure that you understand the specific point that's being argued, because a lot of times wrong answers will play on the idea that test takers might sometimes lose sight of what specifically the passage is arguing for. So you want to make sure you understand that. Then once you go to the answer choices, you can eliminate any that are obviously wrong. So the ones that are obviously wrong, maybe we can put that in quotes, but the ones that are more clearly wrong are going to be the ones that would either weaken the argument or just clearly seem to be irrelevant to, the validity of the argument. And then we want to select the choice that matches your approximate answer, or if you don't find anything that matches your approximate answer, your key assumption, use additional process of elimination to get rid of the remaining answer choices that don't strengthen the argument. We'll see how to apply these ideas as we go and get into some examples. So let's look at this one. Recently, an unusually high number of dolphins have been found dead of infectious diseases, and most of these had abnormally high tissue concentrations of certain compounds that, even in low concentration, reduce dolphins' resistance to infection. The only source of these compounds in the dolphin's environment is boat paint. Therefore, since dolphins rid their bodies of the compounds rapidly once exposure ceases, their mortality rate should decline rapidly if such boat paints are banned. And the question is asking us which of the following most strengthens the argument. So we want to start by identifying the conclusion, and we see this word therefore. That's going to be a signal that the conclusion is coming, that the dolphin's mortality rate should decline rapidly if these boat paints are banned. Okay, so what statement or statements support this conclusion? Well, this one certainly does. The idea that the only source of these compounds in the dolphin's environment is boat paint. So if this compound is detrimental to dolphins' health and the only source of it is boat paint, that would certainly strengthen the conclusion that getting rid of the boat paint or banning the boat paint would help the dolphins in terms of these infectious diseases. And then the first sentence, this really long sentence here, is also a premise. So not every passage is going to have a counter premise. That's something to keep in mind. So recently, an unusually high number of dolphins have been found dead of infectious disease, and that can be linked to this compound that reduces their resistance to infection. Now, what about assumptions? Well, a couple of assumptions here, or maybe questions that we might ask as we read this or think about this passage. One question might be, how long does this residue from boat paint remain in the water? The way this would relate to an assumption, well, the idea here is that if you ban these boat paints, the dolphin's mortality rate should decline rapidly. Well, that would only be true if the residue itself decomposes or doesn't remain in the water for too long. And then another question might be whether the paint could make its way into any of the dolphin's food sources. So again, there's another way in which the compounds in the paint could linger in the ecosystem that the dolphins inhabit, because even if you ban the boat paint, well, let's say some food sources that the dolphins eat somehow have absorbed this compound, then even if you ban the boat paint, the dolphins will still be absorbing that compound or ingesting that compound, and their mortality rate might not decline so rapidly after all. Again, that kind of exercise of thinking about where the holes in the argument might be is really important, whether the question asks about strengthening an argument or, for that matter, weakening an argument. So our approximate answer, I think the key thing that both of those questions have in common has to do with how long the boat paint will remain in the dolphin's environment. So we can use that as we turn our attention to the answer choices. So the levels of the compounds typically used in boat paints today are lower than they were in boat paints manufactured a decade ago. Well, that isn't relevant here, because even if they're lower than they were a decade ago, the passage is telling us that these compounds are still causing problems for the dolphins, so not particularly relevant. B, in high concentrations, the compounds are toxic to many types of marine animals. Well, that's another one that's not particularly relevant to the conclusion of this argument, because this argument doesn't concern many types of marine animals, it concerns dolphins. And we're only concerned about dolphins, and specifically the idea that banning these boat paints would reduce their mortality rate. C, the compounds break down into harmless substances after a few months of exposure to water or air. That is good, and that's a good match for this approximate answer, because the approximate answer deals with this assumption regarding how long the substances remain in the environment. So if you ban these boat paints, and if these compounds break down into harmless substances, then banning these boat paints will likely lead to a reduction in the mortality rate within a few months. So they say rapidly, this says within a few months. I think those are pretty close. I mean, rapidly is one of those words that does need some context, but if we're talking about living and dying, a few months would be relatively rapid. But let's check the other two just to make sure. High tissue levels of the compounds have recently been found in some marine animals, but there is no record of any of those animals dying in unusually large numbers recently. So that does not support the argument. If anything, that would weaken the argument, because that would suggest that these compounds are not really having such an effect on the mortality rate. And then E, the compounds do not leach out of the boat paint if the paint is applied exactly in accordance with the manufacturer's directions. Why does that not really strengthen the argument? Because this doesn't say anything about whether or not the paint is applied exactly in accordance with the manufacturer's directions. Chances are it's not always going to be applied exactly in accordance with the manufacturer's directions, and so we can eliminate that option as well. So our correct answer here is going to be C. Now let's look at another example. The dusky salamander lives only in slow-moving streams where organic debris settles and accumulates. In almost all places in New York State where dusky salamanders used to live, suburban development has cleared uplands and put down asphalt. As a result, rainwater now runs directly into streams, causing increased flow that slows the accumulation of organic sediments. Therefore, it is probably the increased flow caused by suburban development that is responsible for the dusky salamander's virtual disappearance from New York State. We want to remember that our first step is to identify the conclusion, and while the conclusion won't always be signaled by the word therefore, the word therefore is usually a signal that the conclusion is about to be stated. So there is our conclusion. It is probably, not definitely, but probably the increased flow caused by suburban development that is responsible for the dusky salamander's virtual disappearance. As for the premise, well, one premise here we can identify more specifically as an intermediate conclusion. What does that mean? Well, it's sort of a semi-conclusion drawn on the basis of a previous premise. So as a result of what was stated in the previous sentence, rainwater now runs directly into streams, causing increased flow that slows the accumulation of organic sediments. The reason it isn't a conclusion is that it's not what the whole passage is trying to argue for. The previous sentence is another premise, so in almost all places where these salamanders used to live, suburban development has cleared uplands and put down asphalt. And the previous sentence is also a premise. So both of these passages in this video consist of premises and conclusion, no counter-premises, but we will see counter-premises in other passages in subsequent videos. So we've got 3 premises and a conclusion. Now what about assumptions? So one assumption would have to do with this question about streams that have not been affected by suburban development. In other words, this passage is talking about what has happened where suburban development has taken place. But we need to know something about the streams that have not been affected by suburban development in order to make a comparison. Because who knows, maybe their numbers have been decreasing there also, in which case it would make it harder to attribute the decrease in their population to this increased flow caused by suburban development. So that will give us an approximate answer to work with. We identify a key assumption or a potential hole in the argument, and if we can find something that confirms that this is a valid assumption, or in other words, that there is a difference between the salamander population in areas that are affected by suburban development and areas that aren't affected, well, that means that the conclusion is going to look stronger than it otherwise would have. So let's look at the choices. Since 1980, the suburban population of New York State has grown 10 times faster than its urban population. Not relevant. B, dusky salamanders have disappeared in the past 10 years from some suburban areas of New York State that were originally developed more than a century ago and have not experienced significant development for decades. Well, if that were true, that would actually weaken the argument. Getting back to what we were just saying in terms of the assumptions. If we have areas that were developed more than a century ago and the salamanders are still disappearing, that suggests that it's not this increased flow being discussed in the passage that is to blame for the disappearance. So that is not going to strengthen the argument. So we want to make sure we keep the argument at the forefront of our thoughts as we're going through these choices. So what about choice C? The two-line salamander, a species that lives in both slow and swift-moving waters, continues to thrive in streams in New York from which dusky salamanders have disappeared. Well, at first, this might not seem too convincing because, hey, they're talking about a different type of salamander. We want to know about the dusky salamander. But the key thing here is this part. It says it can live in both slow and swift-moving waters, and it continues to thrive even in places where the dusky salamanders have disappeared. So note that the passage says that the dusky salamander lives only in slow-moving streams. Those are streams that have been disturbed by this suburban development. What has that suburban development done? It has increased the flow and basically turned those slow-moving streams into fast-moving streams. Well, if we have some other type of salamander that can tolerate both slow and swift-moving waters, and that one continues to thrive, well, that would suggest that this increased flow really is a major factor in this dusky salamander's disappearance. Because again, as the streams go from slow-moving to fast-moving, that's going to impact the dusky salamander, but it's not going to impact the two-line salamander because it can adapt. You can think of a species that can live in both water and on land. If all of the water evaporates, that species could still live because it can live on land. But if you have some other species that can only live in water and all the water evaporates, that species is going to be in bad shape. So it's that sort of thing. But let's just check the other two. Suburban development in New York State contributes significantly to pollution of local streams with lawn fertilizers. No, that would really just be giving us another possible reason, and it's not strengthening the actual argument. It's really providing another possible argument or explanation. And then E, much of the suburban development in New York State has been occurring in areas that never provided prime habitat. That would weaken the argument, because that would suggest that, hey, this isn't really relevant to why these salamanders are disappearing if they never lived in those places to begin with. So those are a couple of examples of strengthening an argument questions, and the next video we will look at questions that involve weakening an argument.